The famous logician and analytic philosopher Alfred North Whitehead is quoting as saying that all philosophy can be seen as a series of footnotes to Plato. Aristotle described Plato as a man whom it is blasphemy even in the base to praise. When philosophy scholars engage in analysis of contemporary political system, personal ethics, or an analysis of the human soul, they inevitably borrow or critique ideas that at some point germinated at the feet of Plato and Socrates and their interlocutors. Today, we will begin a review of two of the early dialogues in the Platonic corpus, those concerning the events leading up to the trial and execution of the archetypal philosopher Socrates. Today, we tackle the Euthyphro and the Apology. Welcome, good friends. My name is Heraclitus, and welcome to The Good Life, the channel where we examine and review central texts of the Western philosophical canon. It is a great pleasure and honor to have you here. If you wish to see more reviews and retellings of classical works of Western philosophy, be sure to keep up and subscribe. I hope to see you again. Starting with the Euthyphro, we begin in a waiting hall in the Athenian courthouse, where a patient and stoic Socrates awaits the trial that will soon condemn him. He encounters a zealous priest of Zeus named Euthyphro, and they begin talking about the circumstances that have led him to the courthouse. Socrates explains that he is facing charges of impiety brought upon by Meletus. Euthyphro reveals that he is prosecuting his own father for murder, believing this action is his religious duty. This marks an important literary contrast in the dialogue. Socrates in both dialogues is presented as a wise, courageous, and benevolent citizen who is being unjustly condemned by Athenian law. Euthyphro, on the other hand, is portrayed as a corrupt, morally confused, and Machiavellian lawyer who is prosecuting his own father for no good reason except maybe for the social recognition as a faithful priest. Moving on, let's clarify Euthyphro's situation. What brings our Athenian priest to the courthouse is a situation with his father. Euthyphro's father was punishing a hired laborer for killing Euthyphro's slave. As a response, his father kept this hired laborer in chains and neglected him, leaving him to die. In response to this, Euthyphro decided to prosecute his own father for what he considers to be murder, a case that, if Euthyphro wins, will lead to capital punishment of his own father. This dramatic ultima prompts Socrates to ask, why would you take on such a case in the first place? Killing your own father carries significant moral weight regardless of the circumstances. Euthyphro responds by saying that prosecuting his own father is a religious duty that he takes seriously, and that one should do what is pious, even if the consequence means committing patricide. He will then allude to myths that can be commonly seen in Hesiod's Theogony and in other works of mythology. In particular, with Hesiod, Cronos castrates and imprisons his father in Tartarus. Zeus kills, and sometimes in some retellings, castrates his own father, Cronos, and imprisons him in the underworld. Euthyphro, in a perverted mimesis under the guise of law, wishes to kill his own father in an attempt to prove to others that he is a pious example similar to those in Greek myth. I conjecture that this is a virtue signal of piety that would lead others to see that he himself takes this piety and faithfulness to the religion very seriously. After all, this was a man that killed his own father. This leads us to the central philosophical question of the first dialogue. What is the nature of piety? Asked Socrates. Euthyphro is more than ready to commit patricide for it, but what does he say that he is? Can he even define it in the first place? Euthyphro is adamant that piety is that which is loved by the gods, and this immediately provokes a counter from Socrates. He inquires, very well, we now know that piety is that which is loved by the gods, Euthyphro, but which gods? We know that the gods are constantly in a state of discord and strife. Even the example of Zeus killing his own father is proof that what Zeus would like to kill his father, Kronos would despise, which would make an action pious and impious at the same time, pious for Zeus, but impious for Kronos. In the next dialectical movement, Euthyphro settles that piety is what all the gods love, which prompts Socrates to ask again, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Socrates shifts the focus to Euthyphro's answer to the pivotal question. He argues persuasively that if the gods love the pious because it is pious, then piety must be a quality that exists independently of what the gods love. The gods' love is a consequence of piety, not its cause. Therefore, Euthyphro's definition, what is loved by the gods, only identifies an attribute of something, that being that it is God loved, but not its essence. Seeking the essence, Euthyphro suggests that piety is a part of justice concerned with care, therapeia for the gods, specifically a form of service to the gods. Socrates questions what benefits a god could possibly receive from human service. Euthyphro adjusts this to saying that piety is a kind of trading or commerce with the gods. Humans give honor, reverence, and gratitude, sacrifices, prayers, and so on, and the gods give favors in return. Socrates points out that this makes piety a type of skill in commercial exchange between the gods and humans. The suggestion that a mere mortal can do anything for a god is not only absurd, but is even blasphemous. In addition, if piety is a commercial exchange, then we are constantly cheating the gods, because we stand way more to gain than what the gods stand to gain from us mere mortals. Are we really led to believe that such virtuous beings, such superior beings, can be duped so easily by this unequal exchange? Euthyphro, frustrated, leaves the conversation under the guise of attending to business elsewhere. And these are the circumstances leading up to Socrates' own trial. That said, let us move on now to examine the apology. Socrates the Athenian centers himself in the state courthouse, on trial for charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. Meletus is a prosecuting attorney in the case and wishes to charge the philosopher. Hundreds of Athenians are present to hear both men's cases. In a typical Socratic irony, the philosopher apologizes to his audience that he is unskilled in rhetoric, persuasive speaking, and can only hope to make a case based on mere logic and matter of fact. To refute the charge of impiety, Socrates recalls a account where his friend was once informed by the oracle of Delphi that Socrates was the wisest Athenian. Socrates, baffled, took this as a riddle to be solved, as did other recipients of oracular wisdom. In order to be faithful to Apollo, the god of the oracle of Delphi, he set out to answer this riddle by testing the wisdom of others. He demonstrates how absurd the accusation of impiety is, in lack of his obedience to the oracle of the god Apollo. In addition, the oracle's declaration is also defensive because of the exaltation of the oracle will likely make him gain more respect in the eyes of jurors. By testing the wisdom of others, Socrates learns that the wisest men that he could find in all of Athens were craftsmen, that they possessed immense wisdom towards their particular craft, but this immense wisdom led to arrogance, which led them to meddle in the affairs of others, affairs that they were totally uneducated in. On the other hand, he slaps the jurors in the face when he declares that the unwisest men in Athens were those of the political class, because they were ignorant in all fields, practical and universal, yet wished to meddle in the affairs of others. We now have the answer to the riddle. Socrates is the wisest because he is cognizant of the fact that he is ignorant in many affairs. He knows that he knows nothing. This humility is what led the oracle to exalt him, and this explained why he is so good at questioning others. Socrates describes himself as a barren wife who can have no children, no ideas of his own, but he can serve as a midwife, so to speak, stimulating others to have ideas and arguments of their own and to defend them. Socrates defends the claim of corrupting the youth by saying that it would be absurd for him to intentionally corrupt the youth because they are his neighbors, and that Meletus would not produce any victims of his corruption. He could find no witnesses to any youth corrupted by Socrates. Further, in the first book of the Republic, Socrates consistently emphasizes the importance of justice to living the good life. It leads to inner harmony in the soul. Justice leads to inner harmony in the soul. It leads to acquiring of loyal and virtuous friends and makes for a flourishing and peaceful society. Therefore, it would be absurd that he would purposely hurt others because he would be harming himself. He reemphasizes himself to sophists and politicians who charge for their lectures and whose greed leads them to corrupting others. This is a sort of sarcastic jabbing to many of the Athenian political class present at his own trial, suggesting that they were in fact the victims or even the perpetrators of such sophistic tactics. In the end, Socrates' sarcastic jabbing towards his jurors leads to his execution, marking him as the first martyr of philosophy, completing the tragedy. I wish to stress the philosophical elements of these works. Platonic dialogues are first and foremost texts from someone who is trying to spark philosophical discourse. Scholar Junia Annas stresses that the author of these dialogues wants his readers to become passionate about the pursuit of wisdom and virtue. Annas states in her work, Plato, a very short introduction, that Plato is not trying to tell us what to think, but to get us to think for ourselves. He wants us to become engaged in the process of thinking for ourselves, because it is only in this way that we can become wise and virtuous. The way that Plato simulates thought is through the Socratic method, also known as the Elenchus, a systematic introduction of a philosophical position and its interrogation, typically done by Socrates himself. In the Euthyphro, Euthyphro presented a thesis. Piety is that which is loved by the gods. Socrates, in typical fashion of the Elenchus, negates this thesis by saying that the gods are in constant strife, which can make an action pious and impious at the same time, a logical contradiction. Thus, Euthyphro, through this negation, will retain a portion of his thesis. Very well then, Socrates, piety may still exist, but is now something that all the gods loves. This move alleviated the contradiction. Socrates then asks Euthyphro again to describe his terms, to ask if piety is merely an attribute of a thing that makes a god loved. Is it an adjective, a describing word, or is piety a thing in itself, a noun that exists totally independently, that makes the gods love it? This dialectic moves and ends with the famous aporia, as kind of bafflement, known in many of the early Socratic dialogues. The aporia is a state of confusion at the subject in the first place, and in its typical ending to many, and it is, like I mentioned, a typical ending to many early Platonic dialogues. The format of the Socratic dialogue is a form of presentation very similar to dialogues in plays. Diogenes Laertius put it elegantly. The dialogues are composed of questioning and answering concerning some philosophical or political matter, together with a fitting delineation of the dispositions of the dramatic characters who are introduced and the rendition of diction. That said, let us now speak more of the literary elements in Euthyphro. The Platonic dialogues are as much literary as they are philosophical in nature. The Euthyphro and the Apology is drenched in irony of all sorts. In particular, we see the dramatic irony that the audience is aware of, Socrates' imminent judgment and death, yet the characters up to this point appear unaware. There is the irony with which Socrates treats all his interlocutors as wise knowers that hold immense wisdom, yet Socrates himself knows that they possess none. Since you are so wise, Euthyphro, please tell me the nature of piety. And please do not leave me before giving me your definition of piety, or else I will have no wisdom in order to defend myself against Meletus in my trial. This condescension is ever present in many of the dialogues. There is also the aforementioned tragic irony of Socrates as the condemned. Plato depicts Socrates as a hero and a martyr, the most just and wise of Athenians. On the other hand, Euthyphro and Meletus are portrayed as power hungry, confused, and ambitious dogs, rendering the apology a tragedy, where the virtuous man has to suffer the injustice of execution, and the others go on scot free. In the following videos, we will continue the tragedy of Socrates in Phaedo and Crito, the story of the philosopher's imprisonment and execution, and his brave insistence to live philosophically until the end, a living example of why the philosophical life is worth living and dying for. That said, thank you all for watching. I hope to see you guys in the next one. Peace.